Hello health champions! Today I want to talk about the top 10 ways to lose belly fat that are supposedly backed by science. Isn't it frustrating when something's supposed to work and they say it's backed by science and yet it doesn't work for you? That's because it doesn't have to work for everybody to be called science. It just has to work for most people. But once you understand some of the basic mechanisms of losing belly fat, then you can still make it work for you and reach your goals. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. And you can also join as a member so you don't miss anything. The first item I saw on a list was to track your calories. Is that a good idea? Do calories matter? Well, yes and no. You still have to have a calorie deficit. Yes, at some point you have to expend more calories than you take in. But if you try to count calories and reduce calories in a form of calorie deprivation, then that is not going to work, because it's not sustainable. You have to understand the underlying mechanism. And that is, a calorie is not a calorie. It depends on which hormones these calories trigger. So you want to reduce sugar and carbohydrates. Why? Because that is the only way to reduce insulin and insulin resistance. And insulin is a fat-storing hormone. They change behavior. So when you reduce insulin, you reduce hunger. That's the way to reduce calories, not by counting calories. Now consider for a moment, why do we have belly fat? Why does it accumulate in one place? Why doesn't it just spread out evenly? And if it doesn't spread out evenly, which it doesn't, then why doesn't it all collect in the left foot or in the right leg, right? If it was random, it could just end up anywhere. So the answer is it's not random. Again, there are hormones that determine where it ends up. And if we have an imbalance in these hormones, then we have to fix that underlying imbalance in order to correct the problem. So we have to reduce insulin, we have to reduce cortisol, and we have to increase growth hormone. Because both of these have to do with fat storing and blood sugar, and this has to do with fat burning. Number 2 on the list I saw suggested we eat a high-protein diet. Does that work? Well, let's look at the underlying mechanisms. If we eat carbohydrate, it contributes a certain amount of insulin response. If we eat protein, it does a certain amount, but it's much less. It's about 30 to 50%, depending on the protein and how it's utilized in the body, but let's just call it half as much insulin. Whereas fat contributes just a tiny little bit of insulin. Now let's say that for the standard American diet, that we eat a certain amount of protein, a certain amount of carb, and a certain amount of fat. Then the total insulin load would be when we add all those contributions together. So it would be this much. Now, if we want to reduce belly fat and reduce insulin, then we have to lower the total insulin load. Can we do that on a high-protein diet? Well, let's say that we increase the protein by 50%. Then the contribution from protein on insulin would obviously be 50% larger. But here's the beauty, and this is why a high-protein diet can work, but may not work if you don't understand this. If you keep eating sugar and carb, then you're going to bypass any beneficial effects because you're going to bypass the satiety mechanisms. But if you eat good quality food, then what this protein allows you to do is to eat less carbohydrate. So if you eat more protein, you could cut back the carbohydrate down to maybe a fourth and still be very satiated. And then you eat the same amount of fat, but you've still reduced your total insulin load by maybe a third. But once we understand this, then we say, okay, well, a high protein diet could work, but is there something else that could work even better? And that is called a low-carb, high-fat diet. So now we could eat maybe 100%, like the same amount of protein, but let's say we eat what's recommended, a moderate protein diet. So eat 80% of that. It would still work if we had 100. But the difference now is we cut back carbs dramatically. We cut it back to about 10%. So the contribution from carbs are very, very small. Now we need to eat something else to get satiated, to get full and have energy, and that's fat. So we triple the fat intake, but that has hardly any effect on insulin. So now, even though we're eating the same calories, we're having the same satiety, we have less than half the insulin load, and as our bodies get used to this, now we can reduce calories and still be full because the body is eating the fat off the body. Tip number 3, reduce stress. That's a great advice for so many reasons, but the primary here is that there is a stress hormone called cortisol. Cortisol puts you in a fight-flight response. Where in a fight-flight response, the body tries to increase glucose, which will increase hunger and cravings, which will increase blood glucose, which will increase insulin. So here you're stuck in that vicious cycle of stress and cravings and insulin. So if you can reduce stress, then you have a really good chance of reducing all of this and kind of breaking that vicious cycle. So reducing stress is fantastic advice. Tip number 4 is to get adequate sleep. Is that good? Yes, because lack of sleep equals stress. And as we just talked about on the previous slide, you have stress create all these problems, so sleep is one of the ways to avoid those problems. But here's a quick little quiz for you. What is wrong with this picture? And I don't have a lot of time for you to think about it, but the answer is do not sleep with your cell phone because that is unnecessary electromagnetic stress. Put it in another room or put it really far away from you. Don't have it in your bed. Tip number 5, aerobic exercise. Is that a good idea? Yes, but not necessarily for the reason people think. Most people recommend exercise because they think it burns calories, that it helps put you in a deficit. That is not the way it works primarily. And when you do exercise, you have to make sure you don't do it at a high sustained intensity. You do a low intensity with maybe short bursts of short-term high intensity. Why? Because you do not want to increase cortisol like we talked on the previous slide. It does help to use up some carbohydrate. It helps kind of clean up those carbohydrate and glycogen stores, but it's not the primary mechanism, even though it does help a little bit. What it does help is circulation. It helps detox. It helps oxygenate tissues. It helps on so many different levels. But mostly exercise helps with brain activation, and when you increase your brain activity, you also help reduce stress. Now let's look for a moment at what does it mean when something is backed by science and why it may not work for you even if it works for a majority. So this is a purely hypothetical example. I made up every bit of this. Don't draw any conclusions that one thing would work better. But let's say they did a study and they tested a number of different people and they had them jog for 10 days. And these people lost or gained various amounts of weight. And then they did what's called a best fitting line. They take the average and they draw a conclusion and say that out of all these people, on average, if they jog for 10 days, then they lose 1.5 pounds per person on average. And then they had another group, and again, purely hypothetical, and they had them walk for 10 days, and then they draw the best fitting line, and they come up with the conclusion that these people lost 1 pound. So based on comparing studies in science, we would conclude that jogging is better. But what if You were in this study that concluded that jogging works for weight loss, but you happen to be this person right here who gained about 2 pounds. And this is what we have to understand, that everyone is different. There's so many different variables. We don't know what else went on here. There may have been a death in the family, they may have lost their job, there may have been some stress or some inflammation or an allergic reaction that we can't account for in here. Or maybe this person was just super sensitive to stress and cortisol, so anytime they try to do something more, then it backfired on them. That's why we have to understand the principles so that we can start fitting it together into a picture that works for us. We have to understand that statistics do not predict success or failure in the individual case. That would be like saying, let's study what the weather is in Australia today and draw conclusions about the weather in New York. They're different data points and they may or may not have anything to do with each other. Tip number 6 is to lift weights. Is that a good idea? I think so. But the typical advice is to keep more muscle, to build muscle because it's more metabolically active. And even though that is true, that's a kind of small contribution. The main reason is that weightlifting increases growth hormone, which is a fat-burning hormone. It does have a tremendous benefit in maintaining muscle mass. And how does it do that? Well, when you exercise, you're telling your body that, look, these muscles, I'm actually planning to use them for something. I'm not going to just sit in the sofa, because if you sit in the sofa, your body doesn't care if it burns fat or protein. But if you're using your muscles, you're signaling, you're telling your body, these muscles are really useful. Please put some extra resources into rebuilding and maintaining the muscles, and that's the message you get from growth hormone. Then again, there's a slight added benefit in that muscles are a little bit more metabolically active. One more benefit is that when you work out, whether you build additional muscle or not, you're going to maintain a good muscle tone, which is the same as increasing signaling and increasing brain tone. Tip number 7 is to drink some apple cider vinegar. There has been significant amount of research that shows it improves insulin sensitivity. All things equal, it will help. Does that mean that you can just do this? I wouldn't recommend it because yes, you'll see some benefit, but it would be very slight in comparison to what you can do if you do all of these different things or most of these things. Why would you add it? Because it's so simple, it's inexpensive, so you might as well. Tip number 8 is to cut back on alcohol. Is that a good idea? Yes, absolutely. Not because it has a bunch of calories, which is what they usually tell you, or even that it stimulates a lot of insulin, but it's the fact that alcohol and fructose are the two things that clog up the liver more than anything else. And when you clog up the liver, you get fatty liver disease. If it's because of alcohol, it's called alcoholic fatty liver disease. And these go hand in hand with diabetes and insulin resistance. So if you're going to do it, use it very sparingly, especially if you're trying to reverse a condition. And if you drink a little bit of alcohol, then realize that if the alcohol has sugar and or carbs in it, then it's way worse than just the alcohol. Tip number 9 is to reduce sugar and carbs. And now we're getting into the real heavy hitters when it comes to reducing belly fat. High fructose corn syrup and agave are the worst. And now a lot of people are going to choke on their agave sweetened coffee because they've been told that agave is so natural and so good and so low glycemic. And it is low glycemic, but just like high fructose corn syrup, it is highest in fructose, so it has the highest liver clogging potential of any sweetener. Almost as bad as sugar, which is terrible. That's 50-50, fructose and glucose. And then honey Again, a lot of people are going to get a little bit of a surprise on that because honey is about 40% fructose. So it's not quite as bad as sugar, and it does have some natural things in it, but it's still a sugar and it's a lot of fructose in there. And last on the carbohydrate list is starch, which is still bad. It's not as terrible as the others because starch is glucose only. So it has a blood sugar effect, but not a liver choking effect like fructose does. And tip number 10 is intermittent fasting. And now we're talking about your most powerful way to improve all of these things we talked about, to reduce the insulin. Only when you eat does your body have a reason to produce large amounts of insulin. The longer you go without food, the longer you give your body an opportunity to lower insulin. It's also the most powerful way to increase growth hormone, to improve autophagy, to speed up weight loss, and to reverse alcoholic and non-alcoholic fatty liver. And a quick little quiz for extra credit. If you know where these abbreviations come from on this chart, you can put it in the comments down below. Everything I talked about here are tools, and you use these tools to the degree that you need them. So reducing carbohydrates is a tool, and you cut back on the carbs to the degree that you need to. You increase the fasting period until you start seeing some results. And then you balance these two variables, cutting carbs and increasing fasting, until you start seeing changes in insulin and appetite and growth hormone. Carbs and fasting is going to be the most powerful tool for most people. But again, you may not be most people. And that's where you have additional tools. So sleep, meditation, aerobic exercise, weightlifting, high-intensity interval training, these may be for some people the thing that's going to provide the breakthrough or just that little additional edge. What we want to understand is that recovery is just as important as activation. Exercise is activation, but it's also stress and it's breakdown. So life and exercise are stressful, but they're good for us if it's in balance. If we can balance the activation and the recovery, then that's something that makes us stronger. If we don't get the recovery, then it's just breaking us down. And if we do this right, now we end up with balance or homeostasis. Most people are really busy. So they tend to focus on maybe one or two of these things that they can get to, and then they say, oh, well, I'll deal with the other things when my life gets in order. And I understand, but do your absolute best to understand that these are not optional. They are necessary. You cannot express optimal health. You cannot express your genome optimally unless you find a good balance on all or as many of these factors as possible. And realize that we are all different. And that's why you can't just go by what one study says or what worked for your neighbor or the guy next door. We have to start understanding more about how the body works and the principles, and then we can go with trial and error. We can fit it together and come up with something that works for us and that works long term. If you enjoyed this video, I think you really should look at that one next. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.